Welcome back to this digital seminary course on the Bible, or pretty much the history of the New Testament as it happens to be. Anyways, the goal of this course, as you know, is to help you understand how the Bible works, how your Bible works in particular, how it was written, formed, transmitted, translated until it ended up printed and bound in your hands. Now, today, we are talking about how we got from the King James Bible to all of the modern translations that we have today. And the name of that bridge is Tischendorf and Westcott and Hort. Okay, turns out it's not a very good name for a bridge. Let's start by getting some perspective here. All early English versions of the Bible ultimately rested on Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Seems incredible that the first Greek New Testament ever published wasn't published until 1516. Jerome, you'll recall, was asked to collect Latin manuscripts and consult Greek manuscripts because the Pope didn't put much stock in those Greek manuscripts, so Latin was considered better. Anyways, those Greek manuscripts were still around here somewhere, and Erasmus used a grand total of 7 manuscripts to create his Greek New Testament, none of them older than the 1100s. And when it came to Revelation, Erasmus had no Greek manuscripts for the last 6 verses, so he found the Latin manuscript and translated it into Greek. And sometimes Erasmus translated the Latin back into Greek, creating a Greek text that doesn't match any other Greek text. And this is in part why there are some peculiarities in the King James Bible that you don't find in more modern translations. Now, this text by Erasmus, modified throughout the decades, would later be called the Textus Receptus, or the so-called received text. That name comes from a pair of printers who boasted in 1633 that you now have the text that is received by all, in which we have given nothing changed or corrupted. It was that boast that many subsequent Christians took at face value. Look, the received text is perfect. I mean, if it was perfect, my friends, why would Erasmus have to come up with 5 different editions of his Greek New Testament? Why would Stephanus or Theodore Beza keep tinkering with it generation later? In Acts 2:22, Erasmus followed the Greek text rather than the Latin when it came to a particular pronoun, but then Stephanus agreed, but Beza sided with the Vulgate, and it was the King James Bible that followed Beza's text in that moment. And so in that single solitary word, the King James Bible followed the Vulgate rather than the early Greek manuscripts. And this happened in a number of places in the text. Erasmus's first stab at textual criticism was only a start, and it was a good start, but even he recognized it was only a start. At the end of the day, it was a Greek New Testament based on 7 medieval manuscripts. Now, Stephanus consulted 14 Greek manuscripts, a little bit better. And later on, we found more and more and more of these Greek New Testaments, and we've continued doing what Erasmus started by consulting them and building a Greek New Testament. In 1707, John Mill revolutionized New Testament textual criticism. He published Stephanus's Greek New Testament from 1550, but it was his footnotes that made the difference. Mill had access to 100 Greek manuscripts and found 30,000 places where the manuscripts didn't agree with each other, or scriptures quoted by the early church fathers. Now imagine the shock of thinking that the received text was the original New Testament, only to learn nearly 200 years later that no, in fact, there are a bunch of Greek manuscripts, and there are more differences between these Greek manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. If we don't know what the New Testament says, then what is our faith based on? One way of responding to this question was to double down on the Vulgate and dismiss the importance of the early Greek manuscripts, just like the Pope had told Jerome. Richard Simon in France argued that we just have to trust Jerome, that he did have access to the earliest and best manuscripts and that he did a good job in translating them. After all, wasn't Jerome called in precisely because there were so many bad manuscripts floating around? And now we've found these bad manuscripts. We obviously don't know how to correct them, but Jerome did because he was alive during the time of the Church Fathers. So, hey, look, those who defend the received text today follow this argument. Now, Protestants might not defend Jerome, but they will argue and agree with Simon, I should say, that these early Greek manuscripts are trash and sometimes literally found in the trash, as we will see a little bit later on. Richard Simon was a Catholic, okay, and his argument was intended to undermine Protestantism. But it's the same argument Protestants who defend the received text use today. We cannot trust the earliest Greek manuscripts. We can only trust those great many manuscripts that arrived in the medieval era, copied by the hands of dutiful monks in service to the Catholic Church. Now, that wasn't the response many Protestants were inclined to follow back then, but you still had to deal with the fact that these Greek manuscripts didn't agree with one another. The Pope had meant for Jerome to solve this problem by collecting these manuscripts, figuring out the best reading, and writing it down. But, as you can tell, the problem was never really solved, only delayed. A German Lutheran pastor named Johann Bengel offered another way to deal with the problem of variant readings, by developing some rules of thumb that will help us sift through those variants to what is logically the most likely original reading. Bengel, just as a little interesting fact, wrote in the early 1700s that he believed Jesus would come back in 1836, missing by a few years the prediction of William Miller. One of the principles that Bengel developed for us is that the more difficult reading is preferable to the easier one. And this is based on the assumption that scribes would have a tendency over time of making the text easier to read, not harder, of wanting to smooth out difficult passages, not making smooth passages more difficult. Well, while this principle has remained controversial, what Bengel was offering us was a way of reasoning through all of those manuscripts toward finding a Greek text that is at least very close to the original, if not the original. And Bengel, in his own version of the received text, began classifying variants based on how confident he was. For instance, he put an alpha next to the reading he thought we could be fully certain of as the original reading. And this is what we now call a critical apparatus, and it's a key component in Greek New Testaments today, because not all variants are created equal. Some are pretty easy to decide between. Others are harder, and a critical apparatus will tell us which manuscripts are on what side and which are on the other side, and a little of why the authors chose the reading they chose so that we can make informed decisions. Now, let me show you what it looks like. Here is my Greek New Testament, and here is Revelation chapter 1 in my Greek New Testament. Together, we're going to look at verse 5, specifically this word lusanti. Now, if you go down to the bottom of the page, you'll see the critical apparatus, and it tells us that this phrase, lusanti hemas ek, is found in Papyrus 18, which is a 3rd or 4th century fragment. It's also found in Aleph, which is the code symbol there for Sinaiticus, which Tischendorf is about to find. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And it's found in A, which is Alexandrinus, another manuscript. Now, it's also found in some other manuscripts we're not going to get into. This critical apparatus lets us know that some manuscripts have lusanti ek, missing the word hemas, and then it tells us which manuscripts support that reading as well. But then you notice this other note, that some manuscripts have lusanti, lusanti, and lusanti. They both sound the same, but the only difference is that one has an upsilon in it. Oops! The lusanti that Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus and these early manuscripts have means freedom. The lusanti with a U in it means washed. And this is why the received text Bibles say that Jesus washed us by his blood, and it's why the NIV and these modern translations, which are built upon the Greek text of Westcott and Hort, we'll talk about them too in a minute, this is why those translations say he sets us free. The manuscript support for the received text begins with that 205 there, which is a minuscule from the 15th century. It also has the support of manuscript 209, also from the 15th century, and 1006, which is from the 11th century. And this is what the critical apparatus has done for scholars. It lets you see the variant readings and then lets you know where those readings are found. And so modern translations say Jesus freed us from our sins because that's what the earliest manuscripts say, the ones from the 4th and 5th century. Now, the medieval manuscripts say Jesus washed us in his blood. So which is more likely to be the original reading? Probably the older ones, right? The reading that only appeared 1,000 years after Jesus is most likely an error, and it's easy to understand why. The words lusanti and lusanti sound absolutely identical, and it's an easy mistake for copyists to make, and that's why this reading is given an A in the margin, which means the committee who compiled this Greek New Testament are confident that we have the right reading here, okay? Now, notice real quick that there is a reading just below it that's given a C, which means the committee weren't really sure which one is original, okay? Take a breath. Does that make sense? The process is really impressive, and I think you should have great confidence in the Bible that you have in your hands. This apparatus was what Bengel was working on and developing, and what Westcott and Hort would really develop for us as well. Meanwhile, more manuscripts were being discovered, or rediscovered, I should say, it's a more accurate term, during the 1700s and early 1800s. Constantine von Tischendorf found the Sinaiticus manuscript at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. This uncial, which is about 15 inches by 13 inches, is the only one of its kind to have a complete New Testament. On a trip through the Middle East in 1844, hello Adventists, to find ancient manuscripts, Tischendorf found one in a basket of papers the monks intended to burn to fuel their oven. Tischendorf was beside himself when he saw what these papers were, and early Greek manuscripts containing much of the Old Testament. And a monk casually noted that they had already burned 2 baskets worth of these papers. Tischendorf rescued what remained, and he returned to Germany. Now, 9 years later, he returned hoping to find the rest of the manuscript, but the monks wanted nothing to do with him. Finally, in 1859, Tischendorf returned a third time, this time with a copy of the Septuagint, which he had recently published. Now, the monk he met said, "Oh, I've got one of those too," and he pulled out of his closet what we now call Sinaiticus, and the monk let Tischendorf stay up to read it all night, and Tischendorf proclaimed that it was a sacrilege to sleep that night. It had most of the Old Testament, which sadly has now been lost, but it had also that complete New Testament we talked about. One problem, though, it wasn't for sale, nor could he borrow it forever. So heading to Cairo, Tischendorf begged the abbot of the monastery to let him copy it, and so he did. 110,000 lines of text copied by hand. Tischendorf was responsible for discovering and preserving for us a great number of early manuscripts, but the Codex Sinaiticus was the jewel in his crown. Now, this work was immediately valued by early Seventh-day Adventists. In 1875, while in an argument over salt, of all things, a critic pointed out a verse in the latter part of his verse to prove his point. And the Adventists replied in the article, but Tischendorf, the renowned Bible critic, and others have pointed out that this phrase cannot be found in the earliest manuscripts of the Bible. The Review and Herald even felt compelled to print more than a few words about Tischendorf's death in 1875. But let's go back to 1844 when Tischendorf was looking for manuscripts in Egypt. Because then Brooke Westcott was studying at Cambridge. Now, Westcott was a brilliant student, writing a history of the New Testament canon when he was only 30 years old, became a great textbook. And the book was popular, okay? But he was best known for teaming up with his longtime friend Fenton Hort to produce the Greek New Testament in 1881. You cannot seriously engage in the field of textual criticism today without dealing with Westcott and Hort. They stood in a long line of scholars who, since Erasmus, were finding more Greek manuscripts and sorting through variants to rediscover the original Greek text. But Westcott and Hort were the pair who set the table at which the rest of us have been sitting ever since. A Greek New Testament in 2020 is remarkably similar to theirs of 1881. Of course, we found new manuscripts since then, but those new manuscripts fall into the framework Westcott and Hort developed. We can find a manuscript today, and we know what family of manuscripts it belongs to thanks to them. And they gave us this methodology of how we can sort through these variants and get closer to the original text than we have gotten before, building on Bengel's work. Now, Westcott and Hort took the idea of families of manuscripts, developed it into that framework we use today. Now, to them, there were 4 families: the Syrian text, of which we have the most manuscripts, and they are the most recent. The Western text, which were early and often inaccurate. The Alexandrian text, which was far more careful. And then the neutral text, which were free from corruption, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. We have since modified Westcott and Hort's ideas. What they call the Syrian text, we now call the Byzantine text, and we no longer think there are any neutral texts free from errors. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are Alexandrian texts. They are certainly not neutral. But when the Society for Biblical Literature wanted a foundation for their own translation, they started with Westcott and Hort. Their work remains solid. Westcott and Hort remind me a lot of Jones and Wagner, 2 young Adventist ministers living around the same time who made waves by challenging the old guard in the church. Jones and Wagner were, on the whole, I think, correct, but they could also be very rude, impatient, impolitic. Westcott and Hort certainly won no awards for gentleness, okay? When he was 23, Hort called the received text villainous and vile. And this has set both men up for some rather bitter attacks by defenders of the received text in the King James Bible. You can find any number of websites calling Westcott and Hort devil worshippers who denied all sorts of doctrines, and they did deny some doctrines that we would consider essential today. We can understand why their easy dismissal of the received text could anger people. It's not hard to understand why those people would want to find some reason to undermine the work of Westcott and Hort. But I think we need to differentiate the men from their work, okay? So let's agree. Let's say that Westcott and Hort didn't believe in miracles or some of this other stuff that's said about them. Let's say that's all true. What matters is whether or not they produced a credible Greek text, okay? Erasmus, who gave us the received text, was a Catholic his entire life. He didn't agree with Luther, didn't like Luther. But these received text people have no problem with the stuff Erasmus believed. Only when it comes to Westcott and Hort are their theological convictions somehow disqualifying their work. And I only bring these up because these personal attacks on Westcott and Hort are so common in fundamentalist circles. And all I want to say about that is that we should critique their work, not their theology. One of the enduring pieces of literature that they left us was Hort's introduction to the Greek New Testament. And if you're interested, it's well worth your reading. You can find it on Amazon. It's just brilliant. It explains the need for textual criticism so persuasively, so clearly, that it's still studied by graduate students today. Now, Westcott and Hort both served on the committee to revise the King James Bible, which came to be called the Revised Version, and which was later modified in America to become the American Standard Version. Given how many manuscripts had been found since 1611, it was time to put them to use and revise the King James Bible. In the same way, the King James Bible had been a revision of the Bishop's Bible, which is to say, the goal was to situate the New Testament on a foundation of these new Greek manuscripts while keeping the language in that traditional style that people loved. This doomed the Revised Version, of course, because by situating its New Testament text on Westcott and Hort's Greek text, they were going to annoy the traditionalists who favored the received text. And by sticking with the English of the Tudor period, which the King James Bible had, they were going to annoy the readers who were happy that they didn't live in 1611. Okay? Nevertheless, it sold 2 million copies in its first few days. The Revised Version was a scholarly success. Where it faltered in comparison to the King James Bible was in literary beauty. The king had just managed to balance scholarship and literary beauty so well. And when the Revised Version came out, Adventists were curious about the implications it would have. So they advertised a book in the Review and Herald by one of the Americans on the revision committee, on the American side of the Revised Version, explaining the changes that were made, just in case any church members wanted to educate themselves about this new Bible that was coming out. Now, the Revised Version, later the American Standard Version, were quoted frequently in the pages of the Review and other Adventist publications like Signs of the Times. In 1907, a reader asked Signs of the Times, "Why do you not quote from the accepted version?" He means the King James Bible. "Many people do not have the American Standard and think you are misquoting Scripture." The answer that Signs of the Times gave was swift and clear. This is what they said. "We quote from the American Standard Revision because it is the very best translation there is in existence." The author went on, "We can assure our readers that almost invariably they are getting the thought of the words of the language which the Lord gave his book to us better through the American Revised Version than they are in the Common Version." What the author means is, you're getting the thoughts of God more clearly through the American Standard Version than you are through the King James Bible. That was a mic. I just dropped the mic. Anyways, as fundamentalist thought arose in America, of course, there came to be a backlash against those who read the Revised Version and any other text based on Westcott and Hort's work. B.G. Wilkinson published a book on the primacy of the King James Bible against these modern translations, and he helped influence the rise of the King James-only movement that would come up in fundamentalism. The basic tensions were now in place to define the debate over the dozens and dozens of modern translations that were just about to come out. So we're going to talk about where the NIV and the ESV and the New King James Version come from in our next video.